Bienvenidos todos.
No hay
Empezamos
password,
en un
¿verdad,
minuto.
Vivi? No hay ningún password, ¿verdad?
No.
Bienvenidos todos. Empezamos en un minuto.
La publicamos más de
Ah, live on Facebook.
Vivi.
Sí. Dime, ¿ya empezamos?
Por favor, bienvenidos sean todos.
Muy bien. Bueno, pues buenas tardes a todos. Por parte de la Keilah Ashkenazi, nos da muchísimo gusto darles la bienvenida para que puedan gozar, digamos, un nuevo capítulo de este ciclo de conferencias sobre la Shoa y el antisemitismo. El día de hoy tenemos al increíble señor Michael Berenbaum, quien será presentado por Jaime Muro y Jaime Romanowski, y a quien se le hará la entrevista hoy sobre la ética y el holocausto. Sean todos muy, muy bienvenidos. De verdad, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y esperemos que este evento les sea de utilidad. Gracias.
Okay. Well, guys.
Antes de comenzar, quisiera darles las instrucciones para escuchar la traducción simultánea. Todas las personas que están en un celular o en un iPad deben de seleccionar los 3 puntitos que tienen hasta abajo, dar clic en interpretación o traducción y seleccionar el idioma de preferencia. Lo pueden escuchar en inglés o en el que será el idioma original o bien en español. Si están en una PC o en una Mac, por favor den clic en el icono del mundito, de un mundo. Ahí dar clic en interpretación o traducción y seleccionar el idioma que quieren escuchar, ya sea inglés o español. Muchas gracias.
Okay, guys. Thank you for coming again. Again, another interesting Sunday in the pandemic era. And we thank the Keilah Ashkenazi. We thank the Universidad Anáhuac, the Center for Rabbin Studies, and our dear friend, Tami Kolangi. We thank friends of the UNAM. We thank friends from the Morei Morim Leoraata Shoa, which is the graduate group from Yad Vashem that teach all over the world. Today we have a great audience in San Diego. We have in Spain, Israel, San Diego, California with my tocayo here, Jaime Romanowski, people in Argentina and Paraguay, Brazil. And well, we welcome everybody. We have already 100 participants. As they come along, probably Alberto and us, we will broadcast some directions in the chat. Here we have today our dear friend, teacher, and I believe, and I do believe very, very strongly, he's our leading scholar in Holocaust studies all over the world. Michael has been 3 times in Mexico today in a virtual Zoom mode, but he has been twice physically in Mexico over the last 8 years. And it's welcome you again, Michael. It's a great pleasure to having you here in the pandemic era. So let me read a little bit about the bio of Michael. It's very important I'm sure you've seen him many times or read about him. Michael is a writer, lecturer, and teacher, consulting in the conceptual development of museums and the development of historical films. He's director of the Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at the American Jewish University, where he's also a professor of Jewish studies. He was the executive director of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. For the 3 years, he was president and chief executive officer of the Survivors of the Shoa Visual History Foundation from 1988 to 1993. He serves as project director of the United Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, overseeing its creation. He was deputy director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, where he authored its report to the president. I believe it was Reagan, no?
Carter.
Huh?
Carter.
Carter, I'm sorry. Berenbaum was a conceptual developer on the Illinois Holocaust Museum and the educational center that are open in Skokie, Illinois, and played a similar function as conceptual developer and chief curator of the Belzec Concentration and Killing Center Memorial at the site of the death camp. He was a conceptual developer on the Memoria y Tolerancia Museum in Mexico, and a historian at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. He recently developed 3 museums in Skopje, Macedonia, North Macedonia, the Memorial Museum to Macedonia Jewry in Skopje, in Dallas, the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and in Cincinnati, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Museum. Berenbaum, Michael, is the author and editor of 22 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. His work in film has earned him multiple awards. He has been the producer, co-producer, executive producer, historical consultant, writer, and interviewer, and interviewee on more than 24 films in multiple languages broadcast throughout the world. His work in film has earned Emmy Awards, and films he has worked on, films that have earned more than 12 Emmy Awards and have 4 Academy Awards. He has written and lectured widely in films, most specifically those dealing with the Holocaust. Michael, it's an extreme pleasure to have you here and waiting eagerly to listen to your talk today. And Jaime Romanowski is going to probably right now talk a little bit about the summary of the talk.
Yeah. Hello, Michael, again. It's really an honor to have you with us. And in the past 3 weeks, we saw 2 documentaries, one Day in Auschwitz and the other one, Anne Frank's Parallel Stories, which you appear briefly. Well, anyway, everyone understands that the Holocaust, the eruption of evil of a magnitude never before experienced in history, has ethical implications. This seminar will examine those ethical implications in many spheres: political and religious, legal and medical, national and individual, by one of the leading writers on post-Holocaust ethics in the world today. Michael, thank you very much. It's a pleasure indeed to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Jaime. And Jaime, I am always pleased to be in Mexico. I want to correct only one thing. I've been in Mexico City many times.
Oh, many times.
I've been in Mexico City many times, in Mexico many times. The only difference is that I've only lectured for your group on 2 occasions and this Zoom. And I hope that we all live healthily and well so I can come back to Mexico when Mexico is willing to allow Californians back into Mexico, because we're not dangerous.
Michael, before we enter the actual talk, we have 2 questions, one from each one of us. You know, after reading your bio and have continued achieving new heights in your career since we met you for the first time, you've done pretty much an expert in Jewish culture and Holocaust. What's next for you in the next few years?
That's a very good question. I've had one tremendous break in life. which is that I've always worked from something I knew in a field I knew nothing about, and therefore I had to learn. So I begin to look around and accept challenges to create things that I don't know much about, and that's one of the ways in which I keep learning. Right now, I'm learning to live in isolation, which is very difficult for all of us, but most especially for those of us who thrive on human contact. I'm learning to teach remotely like we're doing today, and I'm trying to figure out in a very important way. I've been creating institutions that people come to. Now I have to figure out how do I bring the institutions to the people because they can't come. Film is one of the ways in which we do it, and I'm working now on 4 different films that are in different stages of development. But I'm also involved in, or potentially involved in creating museums in, hopefully in Poland, in the Warsaw Ghetto area, and also in Romania. And Romania has a unique role in the Holocaust, which is very simply, it was both an ally of Germany, participated in the killing, yet it killed others more than it killed its own in a very peculiar way. And it brought Jews to a whole area where they deported them. They put them on railroad cars, but they didn't know what to do with them, so they had them die literally on the railroad cars of starvation and hunger and heat and cold. So I always am welcoming challenges. And I just did something very interesting and very fascinating. Last Wednesday night, I participated in an evening in celebration of a colleague of mine who is now 98. And he wrote his autobiography. And he wrote his autobiography at 98. He was a German Jew who came to the United States, went back. In the United States, he began as an enemy alien, and then he ended up in the US Army and began his work in something called the Ritchie Boys. The Ritchie Boys were German Jewish refugees who were recruited by the US military to be interrogators and advanced intelligence, to be mayors of occupation towns, to be translators, and because they were familiar with German culture, they in a very real sense were the eyes and ears of the American army as it was engaging in invasion, as it was interrogating prisoners, as it was going on. And I interviewed him. So my first question to him is, why did you wait so long? If you're reaching 98 years of age, it takes a little bit of chutzpah to wait to 98 to write your memoirs. So he said, well, I would give somebody else an advice, which is that begin at the young age of 85 or 90. It was a little bit harder. At 98. Let me tell you one more story about him. Actually, 3 stories about him that were cute. The first is he meets somebody who is a very high-ranking German officer from his town. But the German officer doesn't know that he was a child in that town. So he starts asking about people. How is so-and-so the grocer and so-and-so the doctor and this school teacher and whatever have you? And the German officer then says in German to his colleague, he said, my God, they have the best intelligence service I've ever seen. They know who lived on every block in the town. How the hell am I going to hide any information from this guy? Because he didn't realize that he was talking about his hometown. The second is he did something that was quite unusual. He found out that the thing, when you interrogate people, the thing you're worried about the most, you have to figure out what is the thing they're most worried about. So he figured out that every German who was captured wanted to be captured by the Americans and not by the Russians, because the Americans were going to adhere to the Geneva Code. They were not going to torture and whatever have you. So they had trouble breaking some prisoners, getting them to talk. And he came in and dressed himself up as a German soldier, came in as a German soldier and said, I want this guy to come over to the Russian side and I will interrogate him. And he fought directly with the American interrogator, who was another German Jew. And the Germans would then say, I will speak to the Americans, but I will not speak to the Russians. He left the room, and that's the moment at which they spoke. He did one more thing, which was to have fun, because it's no fun to spend your time in interrogation all the time. And this is a little bit of an off-color joke. He said, as a joke for April Fool's Day, he said he had captured Hitler's latrine officer.
Latrine.
The man who controlled Hitler's going to the bathroom. And he wrote up an entire report about what it was like to capture Hitler's latrine officer. So that report then went up the chain of command, and everybody laughed because they understood that this was a joke, except for one high-ranking official who wasn't too smart. So he immediately called Washington, and they were going to send over a very high-ranking general to be able, and a psychologist to be able to interpret what he found out about Hitler. And then they had to, they were afraid that if they really sent over this high-ranking official, then all of a sudden these guys would be court-martialed. 3 interrogators would be court-martialed, and they'd be shot for playing games with the army. So they tried to have a joke, and the joke ended up being a joke on them. 30 years later, he reads a treatment of American intelligence, and he reads that 2 professors in England have taken very seriously Hitler's latrine officer, and they had fun, and they said Hitler had a irregularly shaped scrotum. Now, Jaime, Jaime in San Diego, you're a physician, you're a dentist, you'll tell them what scrotum is. So all of a sudden, they had made a big deal about Hitler's incredibly done scrotum. So the point being that as long as you remain young and creative, you have plenty of time. If God is good to you and you're healthy and you don't get this corona, you have plenty of time to do your creative work. And I'm always awaiting new challenges, which are fun. I'm also working with the Memorial a little bit to try to get them a railroad car for a temporary exhibition, a special exhibition that's going to go throughout Mexico.
Perfect. Tocayo.
Michael, I have a question. I have a question regarding today's topic. And you've written a lot about anti-Semitism. And my question is, how has anti-Semitism evolved throughout the years? Different type of anti-Semitism we have today compared to the one before Second World War. Your book, not your father's anti-Semitism.
That's a very good question. It's going to take us a little bit longer than to get to the topic of today, but you've asked an essential question. I'm going to talk about American anti-Semitism and then also talk about global anti-Semitism. If you go on the Pew survey in the United States, what's the most admired religion in the United States? The irony, of course, is the most admired religion in the United States is Judaism. Now you ask yourself the question, how is it that Judaism is the most admired religion in the United States and anti-Semitism, for everybody's understanding, is clearly on the rise? You have to take 3 things into account. Number one, The reason that Judaism is the most admired religion in America is it has the least number of full-time enemies. The Roman Catholic Church is divided between the pews and the pulpit. The Roman Catholic Church also lost enormous credibility from the cardinals and the bishops on down because of the sexual scandals in the United States, most especially because of the children's scandals. And it also has problems with regard to some of its fundamental teachings and the way in which they're observed. So on divorce, abortion, and birth control, there's no difference in behavior between Roman Catholics and the rest of the American population, though clearly there's a great difference in the teaching of the bishops. Protestantism is divided between evangelicals and mainstream Protestants. We've been taught in the United States to fear the Muslims, most especially with regard to terrorism. Nobody understands Eastern religion very well, so Judaism ends up being the most admired religion in America. Why then is anti-Semitism on the rise? My argument is fourfold. Number one, less people are anti-Semitic than ever before, but the anti-Semites have a megaphone in the internet, which is they can get their information out all over the place, loud and clear and strong because of the internet. And they feel mutually supported, strongly supported by the social networks. So even though there are less anti-Semites, they are more vocal, and they don't feel themselves isolated. They feel themselves supported in a very deep way. They feel themselves supported by all of the social networks, and they're in communication with each other, and it's global. There is anti-Semitism on the right in the United States, which comes from what we would call the white supremacists who want America to be rebuilt along a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. And they say the Jews will not replace us, and the Jews will not replace us means that Jews advocate a policy that is for immigration, that is for pluralism, for tolerance, and for a multicultural society, and consequently they don't want to deal with Jews, and they regard Jews as conditionally white. The extreme left in the United States is anti-Israel, and that means that in a very real sense, when they identify Jews with Israel, they are potentially anti-Semitic. And the other thing is that we have to understand that there are three conditions of it. One is, what's the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israel? And this was given to us by Natan Sharansky, who said there are 3 Ds. When you have double standards, you judge Israel by one criteria and the rest of the world by another criteria. When you go to delegitimation, which means Israel is an imperfect entity, it's done bad, therefore it has no right to exist. So let's take an example. If you say Israel is occupying other people's lands, therefore it has no right to exist. So you have to say that Canada has no right to exist. The United States has no right to exist. Australia has no right to exist. A whole range of countries occupy other people's territories. And the last element of it, which is most important, is when you regard Israel and Jews as demonic and therefore as the source of all evil. Anti-Semitism differs in its origin. Is it religious? Is it political? Is it social? Is it economic? And in the Nazi case, it was racial based on the blood. And anti-Semitism also differs by how high a priority it is for the anti-Semite. And in the United States, we have one advantage, which is other parts of society are hated more than the Jews. And anti-Semitism also differs with how uncertain and unsettled the population feels and how much the population feels that it's in turmoil. Now that for us becomes terribly important because we are now facing 4 crises. You can even say 5 crises in the United States. We all have a health crisis. The health crisis has also yielded an economic crisis. We also have a social justice crisis, which is what's erupted in demonstrations throughout the United States. We have a leadership crisis because our political leaders and our political institutions are less trusted and less admired than they have ever been, at least during my lifetime. And finally, we have a climate crisis, which at least some segment of our population, of our political world, is not addressing. So when you have these crises, and you have one final condition, which is that parts of our political leadership, and in this case, our president in particular, knows how to fan hatred and division. So even if he's not an anti-Semite and his own personal relations with Jews are not problematic, he makes accusations against Jews, he makes statements about Jews that are then regarded as accusations. So he says, for example, Jews are not loyal enough to their prime minister. You're not loyal enough to your prime minister, as if all Jews were Israelis. He, for example, said to the National Jewish Republican Coalition, his supporters, you don't know how to deal with me because I don't need your money. Associating Jews with money, he said, you're also good deal makers. You and I share in common that you're deal makers, asserting Jews with regard to commerce. And finally, a statement about Charlottesville that there were good people on all sides. One group was neo-Nazis. That was regarded by anti-Semites as what? As a signal that you can, that the president understands anti-Semitism. We recently have one other thing, which is the participation of the president in conspiracy theories. And again, take an example, George Soros, who is an identified Jew, Holocaust survivor, was blamed for the caravans coming through Latin America that were going to invade the United States. He was blamed for the demonstrations of Black Lives Matter. He's blamed for supporting immigration. And consequently, you have all of these techniques taking, all of these accusations taking place at once. There's another concept with regard to anti-Semitism, Jaime, that we should pay attention to. It's called a whack-a-mole. There's a game in which if you hit something down here, something pops up over there, and that ends up being the whack-a-mole. That ends up being, it morphs into a different shape. Now, anybody who tells you that they understand what anti-Semitism is going to be like after we get out of this crisis, nobody can predict what it's going to be. The only thing I can say is it's going to be worse. Now, with all of that bad news, let me give you one piece of, actually 3 pieces of good news. And I'm giving you a longer answer than you wanted, but let me give you 3 pieces of good news. The first piece of good news, especially in Western Europe, is that however much anti-Semitism there is, the leaders of Western Europe are opposed to anti-Semitism. And consequently, you had the tremendous demonstration in Paris on the Champs-Élysées, in which you had the leaders of Europe coming out against anti-Semitism because they see that anti-Semitism is the enemy of liberal society. The Prime Minister of France said France without its Jews is not France. The second piece of good news is what happened last week with the potential for the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And that means that to segments of the Arab population, Israel is less distrusted than Iran. They would rather Israel have a nuclear bomb than Iran have a nuclear bomb. And consequently, they have a de facto alliance with Israel, which means in a very real sense that they are going to be less of a support for anti-Semitism, and we're going to see developing in other parts of the Arab world, perhaps fairly soon with Sudan, perhaps even with Morocco, relations with Israel, and thus a little bit of a calming down of the anti-Israel sentiment, which also translates into the anti-Jewish sentiment. And the last, and this goes back to Holocaust ethics, the last and one of the most important is, look, Jews are not powerless. During the Holocaust, Jews were dramatically powerless. Jews today, let's look at Israel. Israel is a regional military superpower and a technological marvel that is integrated into the knowledge-based economy of the world. One of the reasons the Arabs are making, especially the UAE, is making peace with Israel is because they understand that power in the world today is not only in the control of natural resources, but it's in the ability to be integrated technologically with the world in what we call a knowledge-based economy. And in a knowledge-based economy, Israel is enormously powerful and enormously significant. Let's give you a simple example. We've all heard about BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But in a very real sense, you can't use Apple computers or cell phones. You can't deal with Microsoft products. You can't deal with Intel chips. You can't deal with all sorts of medical devices without dealing with Israel, because Israel is integrated into the global economic and technological marvel of the world. And the last thing that I tell the American Jewish community is we are also an empowered community and consequently have the capacity to deal with anti-Semitism in a way that's radically different than the anti-Semitism we previously experienced. So that's a short-winded answer to a very complex question. Gentlemen, I don't see you on the screen, so you'll have to tell me where to go now.
Well, you can start the talk.
Okay. There's
the introduction.
There's the inner statement. Before I give my speech, let me say a few words.
Okay.
So what I think you've done is, by asking me these questions, you've taken me in a little bit of direction. I want to say that we all recognize the Holocaust as a formative event. I regard it as a transformative event in world culture. It illustrated some of the greatest problems of 20th century humanity. It also led to the creation of what we would call a post-Holocaust ethics. Let me talk, since most of the people on this call are Jews, let me begin by talking about the most important ethic that the Jews came out with. In Hebrew, they say, "Ubemotam tzivu lanu et hachayim." In their death, they commanded us to life. And the single most important thing that the Jews decided in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, and it wasn't an automatic decision, the single most important decision they decided was Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people are going to live. Let me give you 4 illustrations of it in very anecdotal ways, but very important ways. There's a woman in the United States by the name of Romana Strachlitz Primus. She said, my parents had met briefly in Birkenau, where both were imprisoned. They each had lost spouses and children in Birkenau. My father came out weighing 88 pounds. My mother came out weighing 78 pounds. And they had experienced tremendous loss. I was born in Bergen-Belsen. I was born 15 months after my parents were liberated. And I was born into a thriving Jewish community. My parents had the capacity, and the Jewish community that I was born in had newspapers, theaters, concerts, schools, youth groups, synagogues, and it had an explosive birth rate. Think of this for one moment. The largest birth rate in Europe in the aftermath of World War II was in the displaced persons camp. Germans were not giving birth to more children. French were not giving birth to more children. Poles were not giving birth to more children. Soviets were not giving birth to more children. The people who had been victimized gave birth to children, and giving birth to a child is the greatest belief in the future, even the future you don't believe in. I once interviewed a man by the name of Rabbi Arnold Weider. Arnold Weider was a mole in Boston, and I asked him just in conversation, I said, tell me something, where did you get your training? He said, I got my training in Bergen-Belsen. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, my father was a mole, and immediately after the war, what we did was we circumcised the boys who were not circumcised between 1941 and 45. And we also circumcised the boys who were born immediately after the Shoa. And I listened to that and I thought about what he was saying. And consider this and consider how startling it is. For 5 years, if Jews lowered their trousers, the mark of circumcision, the mark of a Brit Milah, meant they were condemned to die. In the 6th year, before they knew where they would live, before they knew if Nazism was going to be reborn, before they were able to recreate another life in freedom, these Jews circumcised their sons and gave them an indelible mark, which was essentially to say, death does not have the final word, life has the final word, and we've decided on Jewish life. Now, some of you will know the story of Madeleine Albright, who was the American Secretary of State, who saw her grandparents' names on the wall in Prague and realized all of a sudden that she had Jewish grandparents. Now, most people don't believe that she didn't know it before, but I knew Madeleine Albright as a colleague when I taught at Georgetown. And what I knew about Madeleine Albright was that she is a very smart woman, and she's also a woman who has courage. Now, how could she not know her grandparents were Jewish, especially since she had Jewish cousins? And the reason for that is that she had learned deeply in her experience not to go near the Jewish question. Her parents, once they got out of Czechoslovakia, they were called Czechoslovakian patriots, hid their Jewishness and decided to use the occasion to assimilate and turn their back on Jewish life. And what happened instead, which was very dramatic, very significant, is that they used that opportunity to take assimilation to its final stage, which is to disappear as Jews. But that was not the decision of the Jewish people. The decision of the Jewish people was to recreate Jewish life. And look what they then did. They then established, 3 years later, we established the State of Israel, which was the ultimate expression of Jewish life, bringing Jews together and essentially reintegrating Jews into their own land, their own country, giving them a flag and an army, and trying to, quotation marks in the words of Herzl, and in a word that even was echoed in the agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, to normalize Jewish life, to make the Jewish people a people like any other people, to give them a normal existence. So the first and the most important decision that the Jews made was to live, not a guaranteed decision. In fact, in my work, and I've been writing on this lately, I think one of the most important historical days on the Jewish calendar is the 10th of Av, not the 9th of Av. The 10th of Av is how the Jewish people rebuilt in the aftermath of destruction. And if you want to look at us historically at this moment, we are living in the 10th of Av. We are living in the period of the rebuilding and rebirth and rejuvenation of Jewish life in the aftermath of death. The second decision that the Jews made, which is part of our ethics, which is that we understood that powerlessness invites victimization. If you're not powerful, you make it easy for the victim, for the perpetrator to victimize you. So Jews in the aftermath of the Shoah unapologetically began to assume power and to feel comfortable in the exercise of power. So we learned in a very real sense that powerless invites victimization. Therefore, we must be an empowered people, a people empowered enough also to be able to make statements on behalf of the Jewish people out of a position of strength, not out of a position of weakness, not out of a position in which we are begging, but in a position in which we have adequate power to shape our future. The irony, of course, is that Jewish history is not a single-dimensional path. Jewish history is a multi-dimensional path. So Israel is now resented because of its power. And Israel has also not understood very well that if you believe that powerlessness invites victimization, the question becomes, is power the solution or is power the opportunity? And we've discovered that power is not the solution, it is the opportunity. The last thing I want to talk about Jewish ethics, which is the most important dimension of it, and I believe this is of enormous historical importance. What is the founding story of the Jewish people? And we all know it. If I were conducting a live class, I would ask each of you, raise your hand, tell me what the founding story of the Jewish people is. We understand it from the Passover holiday, which is still to this day the most observed Jewish festival of all. We were slaves in the land of Egypt. We then became free. We went into the desert. We crossed the sea. We went into the desert, and we journeyed to the promised land. The great story of Jewish life is the story of slavery and exodus and the journey to the promised land, which means that everybody, and if you think of a Passover Seder and you want to have a wonderful discussion on Passover, ask everybody, what is your Egypt and who is your Pharaoh? Who is your Moses? What is the sea that you have to cross and what desert do you have to go through? And what is your promised land? And that means that we've all made the story of the Exodus a founding story. And the story of the Exodus is also a remembering suffering, not to dwell on suffering, but to talk about the ethics of what it means to live in the aftermath of suffering. So therefore, because we were slaves in the land of Egypt, we have a Shabbat. Because we're slaves in the land of Egypt, we have ethical behavior that's demanded of us. Because we're slaves in Egypt, it talks about everything from our sexual responsibilities and interpersonal relationship to our responsibilities to return the tools of a person who is in debt so they have the capacity to get out of debt. And therefore, we have made the Exodus a Jewish story that is particular, that is ethical, but is also universal. So every people from all over the globe who think of their story of the journey of freedom have a reference to the great Jewish story of the Exodus. In African American culture in the United States, the great song is, "Go down, Moses, way down into Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." And that means that we've made it a particular story that becomes universal and that makes ethical demands. And that's what we're doing with the Shoah. We're doing that with the Shoah. We have taken a very specific Jewish story and made it a tremendously universal story so that everybody understands the Holocaust is the epitome of evil, and in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there are ethical implications. Yehuda Bauer, my distinguished colleague in Israel, said there are 3 commandments that emerge. He said it to the Reichstag. Thou shalt not be a perpetrator. Thou shalt not be a victim. Thou shalt not be, and above all, he says, thou shalt not be a bystander. In the aftermath of it all, we have to what? We have to respond and assist other people who are going through suffering. In my own experience, I have begun to emphasize that what we have to do is we have to be an upstander. We have to engage with evil. We have to respond to evil. We have to alleviate evil. We have to prevent evil. We have to combat evil. And that's one of the things that happened in a universal legal language by even defining genocide as a crime, and then trying to outlaw it by the Convention on Genocide, initiated by a Jew, Raphael Lemkin, pursued by a great French Jew who was a survivor of the Holocaust, René Casson, with the great assistance of Eleanor Roosevelt. The idea behind it, in a very deep way, is that we have to remember the past in order to enlarge the domain of human responsibility, in order to encourage activism, in order to teach us to be upstanders, not bystanders, not perpetrators, and for the Jews, well, in order not to be victims. There's no sanctity in being a victim. The most important thing is to avoid victimization. And there was a great American theologian by the name of Emil Fackenheim, who was a great philosopher, who said that a commandment emerged, what he called the 614th commandment that emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. And that commandment is, thou shalt not give Hitler posthumous victories. In a very basic way, the bastard cannot win. And the first way the bastard cannot win is by recreating Jewish life. And we even hear this sometimes in the speaking of survivors when they say, Ehrlich in dread, when ich tanze the chasana. He's lying in the ground and I dance at a chasana. And when you see survivors with children and grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren, and you see the generations that have been reborn, you see that the increase of life and the call for ethical life becomes very important. Let's talk about 3 other issues very quickly. The first issue that comes up is, what is the interreligious responsibility? Here, I think we have to talk about what the Roman Catholic Church has done over the past generation. When Jaime asked me the question about where does anti-Semitism differ today, one of the great changes that has occurred is the fundamental changes in Roman Catholic teaching. And the interesting thing is there's a paradox, and the paradox is that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the innocent feel guilty and the guilty feel innocent. So the popes who did the most to change Catholic teaching were popes who were innocent during the Holocaust but felt guilty. First pope was John, was what we now call Saint John the 23rd. And St. John the 23rd, as far as I'm concerned, is a saint. St. John the 23rd was the apostolic delegate in Turkey and was also a papal nuncio in Bulgaria. He helped the Jews by providing them identification elements that could save Hungarian Jews in small numbers. He also did something very incredible, which is he wrote to the King of Bulgaria saying, if you deport the Jews, your place in the afterlife will be taken from you. You must not do that. And when he became Pope, he studied anti-Semitism with a French historian by the name of Julius Isaac. And then he convened Vatican II. And one of the things that Vatican II did was to change the Roman Catholic position on the crucifixion and Jews' responsibility for the crucifying of Christ. And part of what he did was to say it was human sin that was responsible for it, because if Catholics believe that Christ died for our sin, without sin there would be no need for the crucifixion of Christ. And consequently, he changed Roman Catholic teaching. He, in that sense, came to terms with 1,878 years of Jewish life. Along comes his successor, once removed, now St. John Paul II, who grew up with Jews, who before he became a priest was in the theater, had Jewish friends, had Jewish fellow students, even had a Jewish girlfriend. He becomes Pope, and what does he do? He comes to terms with the rest of Jewish history by first of all recognizing the state of Israel. He then goes to Jerusalem in the year 2000, and he was a man of the theater who understood symbolism. And he said several things. He did several things that were important. He said several things that are important. He first of all said that anti-Semitism is anti-Christian. And consequently, what he meant, and imagine if a pope had said that in 1937, 38, 39, 33, 41, 42. And he said Jews are our older brother. For the first time under John Paul II, who is the Bishop of Rome, who was the Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of Rome went to Rome, to a synagogue in Rome. And remember, Jews had lived in Rome longer than Christians had been in Rome. We were there before St. Peter became the Bishop of Rome. He went to a synagogue and he prayed with the Jews, not as somebody who's come to dispute the Jews, but to participate in the Jews. He then went to the Western Wall, which had previously been for Christianity the symbol of the defeat of Judaism, of God abandoning the Jews. And he put a note of apology into the Western Wall. He prayed at the Western Wall, put a note of apology in the Western Wall, apologizing for the anti-Semitism of Christians, not for the anti-Semitism of Christianity, which meant he went one step less important than he should. And finally, under the current Pope, he abandoned the mission to the Jews. And that is, he said what? He said, Jews are at one with God. We do not need to convert them. Their original covenant with God is still in place. And consequently, Jews have the right to live as Jews according to the Roman Catholic Church. Historic transformation. What does that mean? Every religion has to make sure that in its religious teachings, it doesn't dehumanize the other, it doesn't deny the other, it doesn't demean the other, and it doesn't create the conditions for anti-Semitism, or in Judaism case, for a hatred of either Christianity or Islam. And that is that one can have an integrity of their own religious belief without denying the integrity of the religious belief of others, which is a way in which we have to make room for a pluralistic world. Let me tell it to you in a cute story that happened to me many years ago. I was the teacher of a great African-American entertainer by the name of Pearl Bailey. When Pearl Bailey died, I was invited to speak at her funeral. And right before right before I got up to speak, the pastor of the church, it was a lower middle class African-American church in Philadelphia, pastor of the church got up and said, I didn't know Pearl Bailey, but Pearl Bailey knew Christ. Spoke for 20 minutes about Christ. And then I was supposed to be next. I was the rabbi coming in. And the guy who introduced me solved the whole problem. He said a wonderful metaphor that I want you to think about. He said, I knew Pearl Bailey. And what I learned from Pearl Bailey is that there are many rooms in God's mansion, many windows and many doors. And Pearl Bailey liked to try every window and every door. So I now want to give you Rabbi Michael Berenbaum, who was her professor, and who taught her the Jewish windows and the Jewish doors that she had to peek through in order to enter God's palace. And in his introduction, he solved all of my problems and he solved the problems of finding a place for Jews. So think of the world as God's mansion. Think of the fact that there are multiple rooms and multiple doors and multiple windows. Think also about the great Yiddish phrase, which is when God closes a door, it's time to open the window, which is we have to peek in a different way, and we need to make sure that our religion is not intolerant. Let me talk about two more issues in terms of ethics. The first and most important is the legal issues, which is that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, you had a trial of the Nazi judges. And there used to be a philosophy, which is the Nazi judges, Nazi Germany broke the law, but the real implication was something very different, which is not that Nazi Germany broke the law, but Nazi Germany used the law as the instrumentality of destruction. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, it became impossible to claim that you were just following orders. Military ethics begin with the idea that there are just and unjust orders. You only have a responsibility to follow just orders. Human ethics means that law must be involved not only with adhering to the law, but also the achievement of justice. And we have to be very careful that law is not used as the instrumentality of destruction for the protection of human life and not for its destruction. What appears over the Supreme Court in the United States in a very deep way, equal justice under law. The last issue I want to talk about as we go through and prepare for some questions is there was a vast and an unexpected outburst of medical ethics that occurred in the aftermath of the Holocaust. All of you know that the Nazis conducted a whole range of medical experiments that were conducted during the Holocaust. Many of you do not know or do not pay particular attention to the fact that the first to be killed were not Jews, but people we call of special needs, mentally retarded, physically infirm, emotionally distraught, congenitally ill Germans. And that's where the Germans developed, the Nazis developed the mobile gas units and the gas chambers. And that implicated the entire psychiatric community. If you had a child in a mental health, and the people who were killed were Germans, not necessarily Jews. And the people who participated in that graduated from the T4 operation, the so-called euthanasia program. They went on to staff Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor, where millions of Jews were killed. Doctors were brought to trial, and the judges decided that they had to develop a brand new military ethic, a brand new medical ethic in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And the first element of the medical ethic was something very interesting, which is the first element of the medical ethic was that you had to have the consent of the victim. And that is that the human being is entitled to be informed of their treatment and to consent to it. Now, when you go to the hospital and your doctor comes up to you and says, this is what I'm about to do, and asks you to sign a form because that he's informed you or she's informed you of what is about to happen, that all comes out of the Holocaust. It comes out where the first ethic is you are entitled to be informed of your treatment and to consent to it. All sorts of implications came for the notion of what type of experimentation can be conducted. Experiments can only be conducted if that's the only way to get it. If there are experiments that put the human being at risk, they have to consent to it. If there are experiments that put the human being at risk, the doctor, him or herself, must be party to it. And there literally are 10 commandments that come out of the medical ethics, that come out of the decision that was made in the aftermath of the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. Last point which is we can take the example of survivors who have become what we call witnesses, and they have become the greatest moral teachers of our generation. And we who are not survivors, or who are not even the children of survivors, we have the option, which is to become witnesses to the witness, to treat the Holocaust as the place to which we shall not return, and to understand that we cannot be victims, we cannot be perpetrators, certainly. We can't be bystanders, but we have to be upstanders. We have to do something about the evil that we see, and we must continue the efforts of repairing our broken world. And that's something of enormous urgency to our world today and tomorrow. Let's take questions, and we'll go in that.
Okay.
Okay.
Michael, there are a few questions that arose from your talk, and thank you very, very much. It was very interesting. And the first question, which is interesting related to this, is how do you compare the anti-Semitism in Europe to in the 1930s compared to today's anti-Semitism, and especially in the US and some parts of Europe?
Look, I don't accept any comparison with the Holocaust, but that doesn't mean that there aren't important implications. Let's go through what we see in Europe. Let me begin with Eastern Europe and then Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, we see the rise of nationalism, and after the great belief in democracy that occurred in the 1980s, in 1989, 90, 91, and the rebirth of Eastern Europe as free people, we see that democracy is fragile and precarious, and consequently, people are moving toward authoritarian regimes. The authoritarian regimes are right-wing nationalist authoritarian regimes that are beginning to not only challenge democracy, but they're doing something else, which is to rewrite the history of their own country, not to come to terms with the Shoa. So Poland, you know, the Polish law in which you couldn't say that Polish institutions were involved. Poland wants to talk about the heroes and not the participation. It wants to talk about the rescuers and not the neighbors who were involved, for example, the slaughter in Yavavne. Same thing is true in Hungary, so much true in Hungary that the Jewish community has backed out of any engagement with the Hungarian government on the museums to the Holocaust in Hungary. In Lithuania, for example, 2/3 of all Jews killed in Lithuania were killed by Lithuanians. And you have heard from Ephraim Zuroff about what they're doing with the memorials to the nationalists. So there is that anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism you have in Eastern Europe very often is an anti-Semitism that, on the one hand, makes peace with Israel, but not with their local Jewish community. And consequently, the Jews, I have a friend of mine who's a rabbi in Budapest, and he said, I used to have 100,000 Jews who were convinced they're Hungarian. Now I have 100,000 Jews who want to learn what it means to be Jewish because they've been told they're not Hungarian. In Western Europe, the situation is different. You have the governments that are pro-Jewish, and then you have segments of the population on the left and the right who are anti-Semitic. And you also have a Muslim population that is responding not to the events in Europe, but to the events that are local, that are events in the Middle East. And they regard the opposition to this or that policy of Israel as license to attack the Jews next door. There's been some good news in Europe in the following way. Number one, in England, Jeremy Corbyn was defeated, and the Labour Party, which had been enormously tolerant, if not encouraging of anti-Semitism, is now having to go back and to rid itself of anti-Semitism. The second element is that you have what I call in France, anti-Semitism in France versus anti-Semitism of France. Anti-Semitism in France means that you have Muslims populations who have not adopted the ethos of French society and are responding to the anti-Semitism in the Middle East, but not in France. And they are non-assimilated, and consequently they're there. In Germany now, you have the government and everybody to the left of the government fighting the reborn, the resurgence of Nazism itself in the quotation marks neo-Nazi movement. And let me give you three things that are instructive there. President of Germany on January 27th, actually the week before January 27th, speaking of Yad Vashem, says, I wish I could say never again with confidence, but there's too much hatred in our society. We have to understand that Nazism did not disappear in the aftermath of the Holocaust. It went underground, and it was a shame to speak the language of Nazism. And now, 75 years later, it's coming out of the closet. And the reason that the leadership of Germany is combating anti-Semitism strongly is not only because of the Jews, it's because it doesn't want Nazism to reassert itself in German society. Remember, we had a very interesting thing. The president of the German Jewish community instructed his Jewish people, he said, don't wear yarmulke in public, meaning don't be publicly visible as Jews. The next day, you had a demonstration of thousands of Germans who put on the kippah and said, we want to live in a society in which what? You can wear a kippah in public. We don't want to be in a society of hatred. We have to look at the good. In the United States, we have a rise of anti-Semitism, as we've spoken of, and we have a rise of anti-Semitism, but understand, we have a rise of the permissibility of the expression of hatred. You as Mexicans understand that you've been declared in our society as what? As rapists and murderers and thieves and looters. There is tremendous tension about the African-American community, tremendous opposition to the American community. Hatred has been legitimated in the United States, and the society feels itself in imbalance. And that's one of the reasons why we have a different form of anti-Semitism in the world today. Plus, remember, it's global. So that you had people, my daughter goes to Syracuse University. You had anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-foreign students, anti-Semitic activities at Syracuse. And somebody went through the library and airdropped on their phone into other people's phones. They airdropped the manifesto, the rant. I don't want to call it a manifesto. The rant from New Zealand, from Christ Church, in which they killed all of those people at that church. Consequently, it means you're dealing with a global phenomenon. And I don't know enough about the situation in Mexico, but I do know an awful lot about the situation in the United States. Next question. Jaime, you're muted.
The next question is from a person that is a second-generation survivor of the Holocaust. She says, how do you communicate the theme and explanation of being a second generation that is already so much spoken about? How do you pass the message in a way that people will want to still listen to the second generation? She says that her mother was a survivor of Bergen-Belsen.
Look, the first thing we can say about the second generation is you are the exemplification. You are the embodiment of the decision of your parents to give birth to life and not to end Jewish life. So you are the most important historical demonstration of the notion of Am Yisrael Chai, or B'motam tzivu lanu et ha'chayim, the Jewish people live, and in their death they commanded us to life. The more you give authentic testimony to your mother's experience, the more you're able to speak as the witness who grew up and heard her story, the more you will be able to find people who are interested in hearing that story. Everybody, we have to understand something. The Holocaust has taken its place in our world as the negative absolute. We're not necessarily sure what's good, we're not necessarily sure what's bad, but we know that the Holocaust is absolute evil. And we also know that our students are very interested in learning about it because of the absolute nature of its evil. Now, we have to be careful that we don't mean that because the Holocaust is such evil, or was such evil, that we don't respond to evil today. But we have to be very careful to be able to understand the nature of the peculiar evil of the Holocaust and how it empowers us and demands of us that we face evil today. Speak of your mother's testimony, give voice to it, embody it, and transmit it, and the people will listen.
Okay, another question from somebody in the public. It says, much support from the American Jews for Israel has been lost. Is there anything that can be done to reverse that trend?
Well, yeah, the answer to that, in one sense, is that the Israeli, in part, it's a combination of two things. In the American context, the Israeli government has decided to stop speaking to the American Jewish community. The Prime Minister of Israel said that he was much more interested in support from the evangelical community than he was from the Jewish community. The President of the United States said the reason he moved the embassy to Israel was because of the evangelical community and not because of the Jewish community. So we have to speak to each other. We have to continue the relationship of Jews studying in Israel, Jews seeing Israel. We also have to understand that you love the imperfect. And that as Israel was presented to the American Jewish community very often as a fairy tale of all innocence and all perfection instead of in all of its reality. I love my wife, and my wife I hope loves me. My wife fully knows that I'm an imperfect human being. You can love the imperfect, and you can love the imperfect with their imperfections and despite their imperfections. So I think we have to work on it very strongly, and we have to present it as a very great challenge as to integrating it. And I say the American Jewish community has to work on it, and the Israeli community must work on it by reaching out to Jews and speaking our language, which is also very often the language of human rights and human dignity.
Another question from the public. It says, there is a way to speak about anti-ethics of the acts that the same Jewish people did to another during the Holocaust in order to survive. What's your opinion of that? You know, like the Judenrat and the capos and stuff like that.
Let me say something. We're going to learn an awful lot about this. In fact, if you have people who are going for a doctorate in the Holocaust, in the 1940s and 50s, Israel brought to trial the people who were identified as collaborators with the Nazis. The people who were compromised, what we call in the field, the gray zone. And they literally had legal trials of these people. They sealed the records for 70 years. But now these records are becoming public, so we are going to understand how in Israel in the immediate years after the Holocaust, Jews judged fellow Jews who worked and were not always in the highest ethical behavior. We also should understand that we recognize and celebrate the non-Jews who saved Jews, and we pay less attention to the ways in which Jews helped each other, what we call self-help. Let me give you a simple example. Everybody knows the name Raoul Wallenberg, and we should. because Raoul Wallenberg created what is called the Schutzpass and also created the safe houses. But very few people know that there was something called the glass house. And the glass house, you have the underground, the Jewish underground, that for every document that Raoul Wallenberg created, they forged additional documents. So one safe pass became 10 safe passes. And they also distributed them at night and early in the morning against curfew so that people were able to get the Schutz passes all the way through. Jews helped each other, and Jews also were caught in a situation in which they were ethically and morally compromised. We are learning much more about that than we ever did. The great work on the Judenrat. The great work on the Judenrat was done by a man by the name of Isaiah Trunk, who did the very important work of the Judenrat. And we're going to understand an awful lot about how Jews behaved from the very simple situation that, and I just saw it the other day in the work of a second generation woman who remembered when in 1950 her parents were walking down the street and they saw somebody who had been a capo who they thought was responsible for the death of the brother she never knew, because she was born after the Holocaust and her brother was killed during the Holocaust. And her father brought that man to trial. We don't know the results of that trial, but we do know that now those results are going to be available. And over the next 5 years, we're going to learn an awful lot about how the Jews judge the behavior of fellow Jews. Let's take some more questions, Javi.
There is another question that says, what do you think about the complex persona of David Ben-Gurion, which he, during the war, criticized or made comments on the survivors of the Holocaust for not going to Israel or not arriving to Palestine, and his relationship with the German post-war government, which many of them were Nazis?
Let's begin. David Ben-Gurion was a very great man who made very controversial decisions, some of them genius-like and some of them less so. Let's divide that into 3 questions. Number 1, Ben-Gurion's establishment and declaration, the capacity to judge the state of Israel, to establish the state of Israel, puts him in the forefront of Jewish history. We will remember the name David Ben-Gurion 1,000 years from today, and justifiably so. Ben-Gurion also did something incredible in 1939, which is he gave an interesting response to the white paper that prohibited the immigration of Jews, limited the immigration of Jews to Palestine. He said, we will fight the white paper against the British as if there were no Nazis, and we will fight for the British against the Nazis as if there were no white paper. So he understood that the entire future of the Jewish people everywhere was dependent on the defeat of Nazism. The Israelis did not respond to the survivors well in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust because Ben-Gurion was interested in creating the new Jew, was only interested particularly in the fighters and not in the rest of the people. He was afraid that they were damaged, the survivors who came over. They called them sabonnikim, soaps, but the reality is that the Nazis did not make soap out of the Jews, but they treated them with disrespect. That changed with the Eichmann trial, where the voice of the survivor was heard, and Ben-Gurion was responsible. In retrospect, Ben-Gurion was 100% right to establish relations with Germany. And the reason we know he was right is threefold. Number 1, Israel was in desperate need of money for survival. Menachem Begin said he is essentially rehabilitating the Germans, when what he actually was doing was giving Germany the opportunity, a conditional opportunity to rejoin the family of human communities. And since then, over the 70-year period, and that's how you can judge policy, Germany has been one of Israel's most ardent supporters. The most rapidly increasing Jewish community in all of Europe with the least anti-Semitism is Germany. It is ironically, Berlin is the home of many Israelis. And Germany has been steadfast in its support of Israel and its protection of the Jewish community in Israel, in Germany. Let me tell you a humorous story. I was close to the former head of the Jewish community, several times removed, a man by the name of Ignaz Bubis. And I was once on a plane with Bubis, and I went up to him. We were sitting in the same area of the plane. I went up to him, and before I reached him, 4 Germans stood up, all of these tall gentlemen, clearly his bodyguards. And he turned to them and he said, "Sit down, this is my friend Michael Berenbaum. He's not here to attack me." And then he said humorously, he said, "They're more afraid of my being killed than I am." Meaning that Germany wants to make sure, in order to define itself as the anti-Nazi, Germany wants to make sure that it is that it does not go back to Nazism, and that it has a legitimate and appropriate and a free Jewish community. And that, in part, is the best element of Ben-Gurion's controversial policy.
Okay. There is another question from Facebook. It says, the rise of anti-Semitism in U.S. universities has been rising quite a bit. I think you spoke a little bit about it. What's the best solution to avoid that? Is there any hope?
Yeah, first of all, there's hope. Let's begin with a couple of pieces of hope, and let's talk about the problem. Many universities have articulate leftists on the faculty and articulate leftists on the student body. We have to develop the ability of Jews to respond to that and to deal with it. Let me give you, and the other thing we have to say is, let's not exaggerate the degree of the problem. So the best example is BDS. BDS, in one sense, has been thoroughly ineffective. No university has divested from Israel, and in no university, and it has had zero impact on the Israeli economy as opposed to the boycotts of a generation ago. What is BDS, though? BDS is the effort of people to make Israel centered and to make Israel demonic, say you have to divest from Israel. And in one sense, the best response to that is, when I speak at university campuses, and I get myself introduced also as a professor of the University of Haifa with the idea that if you're going to be anti-Semitic and you're going to be anti-Israel, me, not somebody else. It's we, it's not them. So when the students say that, I say, okay, let's take it seriously. Give me your Apple iPhone, give me your Apple computer, give me your Microsoft programming, shut down the library because it's all based on Microsoft system, shut down the records of the university, and that's the way in which you divest. But unless you're willing to go it all the way, then the rest of it is what we call in English bullshit. It's not quite serious. Again, the movement of the United Arab Emirates and the like may lessen some of the anti-Semitism involved. I am appalled, and hopefully at some point in the, Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Abba Eban once said of the Palestinians, they have never lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity. Hopefully someday the Palestinians will ask themselves, we could now be in the 20th year of the Palestinian state. They have to engage and respond to Israel. If they don't engage and respond to Israel and grapple with it, they're never going to get anywhere else.
Okay, the last question from the public. It says, what's your opinion on Turkey, which used to be very much aligned even militarily with Israel, and the last couple of years has increasingly more anti-Semitic and more rivalry with Israel?
Turkey is a perfect example of what happens when authoritarian regimes replace democratic regimes, which is that Turkey had defined itself as a secular democratic society and developed by Kemal Ataturk. And Ataturk was desiring to establish a secular forward-looking democracy. A secular forward-looking democracy was a democracy that engaged Israel, that was able to establish relations with Israel, and Turkey used to be Israel's best friend in the Muslim world. Today, Turkey is an autocratic, non-democratic, non-human rights committed society which has a difficult relationship with NATO, and which itself presents enormous problems to the West. That means essentially that Turkey has become in the grip of the Islamic and the radical Islam, and consequently, one needs a different American policy toward Turkey. One also needs, if I can speak personally, one needs an American president who's tougher on autocratic regimes than the way in which Turkey has been treated by the current government. But it looks like for as long as the current government is in power, and it looks like they're going to have a very tense relationship with Germany, with Israel, and Israel's going to have a very tense relationship with Turkey. And already Israelis don't feel comfortable vacationing in Turkey, and it is a problematic thing. And Turkey, indeed, in the aftermath of the UAE, Turkey threatened to disestablish diplomatic relations, to sever diplomatic relations with Israel. I doubt that they will go that far, but Turkey's relationship with Israel is problematic. Its relationship to its own population is also problematic.
This was another question from the public, which is this is interesting. It says, what's your opinion about President Trump? That is, everybody says that he's the best friend of Israel, and it's the best thing that has happened from the American government to Israel in the last several decades. And at the same time, the increase in anti-Semitism, the increase of anti-Semitism in the Black population has also grown.
Look, let me, the question is, can I talk candidly?
Yes, of course.
Okay. President Trump, I'm not of the opinion that President Trump is the best thing that ever happened to Israel. Let's begin. Some presidents who were tough on Israel were very helpful to Israel. Jimmy Carter, who's regarded as an anti-Semite, was absolutely, and I don't agree with that judgment. I think that's more complex. Was essentially responsible for the Camp David Accords, because it took American leadership once Sadat went to Israel to bring Sadat and Begin together and to get the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords now have been in place, implemented since 82, in place since 79, 89, 99, 209, 219. It's been involved in 41 years, and it took away Egypt, which was the most powerful government in the Arab world, took them away as an enemy of Israel. It's been a cold peace. It's getting to be a warmer peace now, and the like. Jimmy Carter was responsible for the agreement with Jordan. Jimmy Carter also, had the Arabs had a different leadership, would have been deeply responsible for the interrelationship between the Palestinian state and the Israeli state. Barack Obama spent a considerable effort to try to get a peace when the Israeli government was interested in peace. Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem, and we are seeing one fruit of a changing reality, which is that the Muslim world is divided between Sunni and Shiite. The Sunnis distrust Iran so greatly that they're willing to trust Israel as an opponent of Iran. But Iran has been strengthened by its current situation rather than weakened. Trump has been a disaster for the United States economically, a disaster for the United States politically. And one of the major reasons why anti-Semitism is on the increase is because hatred in the United States and the expression of hatred in the United States is on the dramatic increase. And Trump himself leaves us in a situation of deep disquiet because he keeps speaking about the enemies that are coming to attack us. He engages in conspiracy theories all around. So let's acknowledge that he's been good for Israel. I don't think he's been the best. I also think that we have just seen that we're going back to two-state solution because annexation was not a possibility. You can't have annexation in relations with the Arab world. We know that at this point. Israel and the Palestinians will eventually have to come to an agreement. And to give you a sense of how uneasy it is, I just had a conversation with my wife today. I said, you know, if Trump gets elected in this new election, I am contemplating leaving the United States.
Wow.
That's an unprecedented response because I would not recognize the United States, and I wouldn't trust what the reality would be here. Now, that tells you how strongly I feel that this election is absolutely critical. Jewish community is going to be divided. It's going to be divided about 77 to 23, with the combination of some Orthodox Jews supporting Trump and some politically conservative Jews supporting Trump. But at least 3 out of 4 American Jews will be strongly anti-Trump and are strongly anti-Trump. But I have never contemplated, I've contemplated Aliyah several times, but I've never contemplated leaving the United States because I regarded this as a country antithetical to my values and to my own commitments. But I have never.
You can always come to Mexico and teach for a while.
I would be very pleased to come to Mexico. But in fact, I laughed. I said, the other thing I said to my wife is, with us doing everything on Zoom, I said to her jokingly, I said, you know, dear, we can live anywhere in the world now. Where would you like to live for the next several months? Because for the first time, it doesn't matter where you live because you can
work anywhere.
You can work anywhere and do anywhere. Only in your profession, you can't work remotely in your profession. In my profession, I've been able to work remotely, so I can live anywhere.
In I can. What do you think about the Biden-Kamala ticket and their chances to beat Trump? And she's been a wife to a Jewish businessman.
Yeah, look, the good news of Democratic Party is Democratic Party has essentially decided that its best chances for election are not to go to the radical left or the extreme left, to wait for not to go for a revolution, but to go for mainstream center-left coalition, also a mainstream center-left coalition that is pro-Israel. And consequently, if your opponent is playing deep in the in the 20-yard lines, to use a football analogy of American football, if he's playing in the 20-yard lines and you can move to the 40-yard lines, you have 60 yards in which to achieve your victory. Why would you move to your 20-yard line? So I've known Joe Biden for many years. Kamala Harris is my senator. Joe Biden is deeply comfortable with Jews. He too has Jews in his family. He you know, we joke, he knows what shit is like, he knows what Kaddish is like. As a human being, he's one of the finest human beings I know, just as a sheer human being. That doesn't mean he'll make a great president, just means that sheer fine human being. Kamala Harris, again, is a mainstream senator. Her husband is Jewish, but look, Trump has Orthodox Jewish grandchildren. So Jews are now an integrated part of American society. And the question I always ask is essentially, is Biden good for Jews? Yes. Is he good for Jewish values? Yes. Is he going to be good for Israel? Yes, but he's not going to be undemanding of Israel. But sometimes the demands that are made of Israel are demands that push it in a good way. And at this moment, but remember, polls are only an indication of this moment. At this moment, it looks like Biden will win. It looks also like Netanyahu understands that Biden will win or may win, and that's why he was reluctant to go with annexation. He's not going to be able to do to Biden what he did to Obama, which was to decide to treat Obama as an enemy, where Obama was not and is not.
Okay, you have a question?
No, I don't. And Michael, I just want to thank you in the name of the Mexican Society. And we always learn from you. It keeps us thinking, and we appreciate every word you say. And just want to hear you more often and stay in touch with you so that we can learn some more.
Well, let me just say in response that one of the great advantages of the Zoom world is that I've just come down to Mexico and spent a couple of hours with you, and it only took me 2 hours.
That's right. Well, we have
so
another.
Call on me again.
Yeah, no, we have a big announcement because next Sunday we're going to have you again with a new documentary. Can you talk a little bit about the documentary that we're going to see next week? We're going to watch.
What is the documentary next week?
Yours. I mean, what is it? The one we're going to show you, your new documentary.
Oh, I'll be happy to do that. Let me just look at one thing. Let me look at one thing for 1 second. And while I do that, let me say also my friend Stephanie is on. She's been reaching me on the Q&A. And I want to
she's saying hello.
Let me just see what my schedule is. I have something next Sunday, which is cute, which is also funny. I have a wedding in the morning, but a wedding in the morning will only take a half an hour for the football.
Yeah. So it will be the same time.
I'm going to have a wedding. I'm going to have the same time. Be happy to do that, but I'm going to have a wedding in the morning, which is 30 minutes. I don't have to travel cross country. They save a meal. And Jaime, I'm going to kid you. You had your daughter's wedding. You could have invited me without having to pay for me as guest.
No. I'm going to send you the video so you can watch it.
Okay. Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Okay. Be happy to join you again next week.
Okay.
Excellent.
Well, so Michael, as usual, what a delight to hear you explain things. You are such an inspiration, such an ethical and important figure in our Jewish journey. Thank you so much for sharing your views, for explaining why you feel the way you do, for letting us know that we can aspire to a better world if we can only concentrate on the important things. And we will be so happy to have you again next week on Sunday. I think it came as a surprise that we're going to be showing your documentary next week, but we did think that you were aware of that.
Okay.
I'm
sorry. I'm glad you can do it. And so we'll talk some more next week then, okay? So thank you on behalf of the Keilah, on behalf of the Universidad Anáhuac, on behalf of everyone who has joined us today to listen to you.
And we really, really look forward to seeing your documentary next week.
I look forward to it next week as well. Thank you.
Thank you for
you.
being with us. And thank you, Jaime. Thank you, both Jaimes and Debbie. And of course, as usual, we thank Alberto Chacra and Raquel Feldman and Anita Feinfeld, who are behind the scenes, making all this possible and making this a high quality event. But thank you especially to you, my dear Michael. We really love you here in Mexico. Bye.
Well, this session is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube during the next week.
Yes, indeed.